My name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. This evening's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my pleasure to introduce scholar, educator, and author, Dr. Connie Goddard. It's a great start, Connie. The audience already loves you. Wonderful. So her research focuses on the religious roots of schooling in colonial America, 19th century schools on the American frontier, and contemporary issues in urban education. She received her PhD from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2005. Her dissertation treats the legacy of Chicago's educational stateswoman Ella Flagg Young, the theorist and administrator who taught John Dewey how schools function as social institutions. Following her training, she taught at the Chicago City Colleges and then joined the Peace Corps, teaching for 2 years in Romania. Following her return stateside, she has taught as an adjunct at Mercer County Community College and at the state prison in Rahway, an experience that led to her new book's conception. So speaking of that, Connie Goddard is the author of Learning for Work, How Industrial Education Fostered Democratic Opportunity, the book which we are here to learn about tonight. An absorbing merger of history and storytelling, Learning for Work looks at the people who shaped industrial education while offering a provocative vision of realizing its potential today. The book documents the history of the Chicago Manual Training School, CMTS, which was a short-lived but influential institution dedicated to teaching a balanced combination of practical and academic skills. Dr. Goddard uses the CMTS as a door into America's early era of industrial education and the transformative idea of learning to do. Rooting her account in John Dewey's ideas, Goddard moves from early 19th century supporters of the Union of Learning and Labor to the interconnected histories of CMTS, New Jersey's Manual Training and Industrial School for Colored Youth, North Dakota's Normal and Industrial School, and related programs elsewhere. Goddard analyzes the work of movement figures like abolitionist Theodore Weld, educators Calvin Woodward and Booker T. Washington, social critic W.E.B. Du Bois, Dewey himself, and his influential Chicago colleague, Ella Flagg Young. The book contrasts ideas about manual training held by advocate Nicholas Murray Butler with those of opponent William Torrey Harris, and considers overlooked connections between industrial education and the arts and crafts movement. So, that's the book. You'll hear plenty about that from Connie in just a moment. But first, I have to thank Labyrinth for being here to support book sales. They'll be selling copies of Goddard's book, and I understand that she's willing to join us for a signing, so thank you, and thank you. This program also brings into focus a topic which the library's Public Humanities Initiative is prioritizing for this year, that is justice. Throughout 2025, the programming team at the library will be exploring justice from multiple perspectives and through the intersecting textures of our dense social fabric. This thematic programming was launched in January with the panel discussion on history and restorative justice in Princeton, and we continue exploring areas of social justice with tonight's program. Looking ahead, I'd be remiss not to highlight as well a few other programs of interest. So Wednesday night this week, here in the community room at 7, we have a panel on the new Library of America Anthology of Latino Poetry, for which we will have the editor among the featured panelists, Rigoberto Gonzalez. It's not exactly aligned with our justice theme, but if you know the history of the Library of America series, there is a justice angle involved in the publication because it really champions a tradition of poetry that's 500 years old, but has only recently been canonized in American letters. So check that out if you're available. And then on Thursday, the library will have the honor of hosting the Princeton Theological Seminary's Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture, this year delivered by Brandon Terry of Harvard University, who will be joined in conversation by Eddie Glaude. Next week, for more familiar group interactions, the Feminist Book Discussion Group returns on April 7th at 6, and a Catherine Project book group exploring fundamental texts concerned with justice will also launch later on in April on the 15th. So, with all of that said, with all of my promotions done, and all of my gratitudes given, I will thank Connie for being here tonight one more time, and let's all thank her for sharing her work with us tonight. I just magically lower the podium.
I was not prepared for quite such an imposing podium. But I also have written remarks, and if I don't stay on script, I can wander off of it. So anyway, thank you, Cliff. I want to thank you for, Cliff and I have been talking about this for some time, and I thank the library for welcoming me, and Cliff for the nice introduction. And given all of the nice things that you said, I'm going to here. If I stand here, I have the mic. I'll stand here. It's better. I want to say before I begin, as there were a couple of motivations for writing this book. One is I read a lot about John Dewey when I was in Chicago, and I am a Chicagoan, kind of, and I wondered why he ignored the Chicago Manual Training School when it was part of his department at the University of Chicago, and so that was one motivation. Another motivation was one of the schools that I profile, in North Dakota, and pictures from it are on the cover of my book. Actually, my mother had a terrific education there, and knowing how much highly she thought of the school, I wondered why historians in general were dismissive of manual training schools. So that's one thing. A third thing is a dozen years ago, I had the honor, if I may say it, of teaching at Rahway Prison. It was part of a program at Mercer College. And I was teaching there as an adjunct and at TCNJ. And one of the things that occurred to me while I was there was, how come you guys are in here and I can come and go? And one of the things that I thought about was that around the same time the rates of incarceration rose, the number of industrial education classes in high schools fell. Now, whether there was a connection between that, I don't know. But I have his permission to notice that one of my favorite students from one of my classes at Rahway, who is now doing some very interesting work outside, I will get to later, but Damien Stackhouse is here, and I want to say hi to him. And also, sitting way in the back is John Medley, who was extremely helpful in doing this book. He was class of 1954 at the Manual Training School. And if you do your arithmetic, you can think, wow, that was some time ago. And John was kind of the archivist for the school, and was immensely helpful in my doing this book. So I want to say thank you, John, for being here, and thanks for everything else. And so now I'm going to get back somewhat into my prepared remarks, one of which makes the point that manual training programs sort of had some of their start in Princeton. So, I have a bit of an outline for what I'm going to say. And first, the founding of the Manual Training School and the history prior to it. Then the school is set in the Progressive Era and in New Jersey. And then how it navigated its way through various conceptions of industrial education for Black students, for white students, and for all. And over the following decades. Now, what I'm going to do also, because my talk, we will see how well it goes, and if I will ask for questions as we go along, and if we get too far along and not finishing it, there is a marvelous video, which I'm sure the library has, and I will show you, which talks about the school's history from its heyday in the 30s through its closing in the 50s. And I find that's kind of more well-known than the part of it that I'm going to talk about. So if we skip that, we will skip that. But at any rate, so I am going to begin with a remembrance that founding father, excuse me, I'm going to get my water. Our founding father, not of the school, but of the country, Benjamin Rush, he wrote about his own education. In 1753 or so, his widowed mother, sent Rush and his brother off to something called a log college. It was actually both a work camp and a prep school, designed to prepare young men of limited means for the College of New Jersey. Several were located in the Delaware Valley in the decades prior to the Revolution. The one Mrs. Rush chose for her sons was headed by Samuel Finley, later to be Princeton's 5th president, and his wife. At a farm located south of Philadelphia, the Finleys welcomed a dozen or so young men who boarded there. In addition to good manners, habits of prudence and attention, knowledge of scripture in Latin and Greek, Rush and his fellows learned what he called practical agriculture. The harvesting and haymaking, he claimed, contributed to their good health and respect for industry, in this case, manual labor. And I was going to ask, Cliff, is the mic working okay? Okay, I'm in the right location? Thank you. All right. What happened to these log colleges in the years after the Revolution, I don't know. But the idea of combining labor and learning was attracting adherents in and around Switzerland, mainly through the efforts of Johann Pestalozzi and a young nobleman named Philipp von Fellenberg. In 1799, the latter founded a school named Hofwohl that combined learning with labor through farming and handicrafts. It attracted students from families both with and without means, so that they could learn to live harmoniously together. Among Hofwohl's students was a young Scot named Robert Owen. Later, he would migrate to Indiana, where he founded a utopian community named New Harmony, based in part on what he had learned in Switzerland. Another admirer was a New Yorker named John Griscom, who visited the school in 1818. Once back here, he tried to convince New York's Public School Association to establish one based on the Swiss model, but without success. The idea was more successful in upstate New York. In the 1820s, the region was the center of the Second Great Awakening. Princeton had been a product of the first. There, a school recalled as Oneida Academy, there at a school that we called as Oneida Academy, a charismatic proselytizer named Theodore Weld took the log college idea and promoted it as a means of producing preachers strong of mind and body. Vigorous both physically and intellectually, Weld would lead his fellow students in devotions at dawn, then in tending to the academy's fields and livestock, along with the day of classes and study. Their manual labor supported themselves and the school. Similarly attracted to the idea were other young men, products of schools like Andover, Yale, and Williams in particular. With a sense of missionary zeal, they felt called to establish colleges in the rapidly growing states of Indiana and Illinois, as well as in some parts of the South. Among them was Edward Beecher, who had gone west to an Illinois town near the Mississippi, where he served as president of a college founded in part on this evangelical mission to the wilderness. In 1831, Weld's young men of piety and moral purpose attracted the support of Eastern philanthropists. Together, they formed an organization called the Society for Promoting Manual Labor in Literary Institutions. Edward Beecher, you like that? Edward Beecher was on its board, and Weld was its general agent. For the next year or so, Weld traveled to numerous institutions of labor and learning on both sides of the Ohio. In 1833, he produced a report on the most effective practices of such school. The idea was to establish a model version, and Lane Seminary in Cincinnati was chosen as the site. But Weld, along with other proponents of labor and learning, also felt that slavery was immoral. Their growing abolitionism led to difficulties with Lane's trustees. So in 1834, Weld and others departed Cincinnati. Some went up to Oberlin, and thus began its association not only with labor and learning, which is still the school's motto, but with abolition as well. And I'll say, at the end of my talk, or when I stop talking, I have a bunch of slides which may stimulate some discussion, but basically I'm just giving a lecture right now. So I hope I hope I'm keeping your attention, okay? So, Weld himself returned to the East Coast and devoted his considerable intelligence and industriousness to ending slavery. In this effort, he soon met the Grimke sisters of Philadelphia, noted Quakers and feminists. Together, the trio produced another major report, this one on the evils of slavery. Published in 1839, it would later serve as source material for their friend Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. During the 1850s, the trio also ran a school called Eagleswood that was part of a utopian community located in Perth Amboy. Though the school closed during the Civil War, the idea of combining labor and learning led to the founding of other institutions, among them land-grant schools, Rutgers, for example, in 1864, and Illinois Industrial University, which was founded in 1868, or now the University of Illinois, was another. The idea also found its way to Hawaii, brought by missionaries educated in New England. Among them was Richard Armstrong, who had arrived there in the 1820s. The island's royal leadership recognized that its subjects needed a solid education system, one that could prepare young men as teachers and government officials, and they named Armstrong to head it. Among schools these New Englanders established were Punahou, which is where Obama went to school, and another on the big island of Hawaii, which was known as the Hilo Boys Boarding School. Armstrong would occasionally take his young son Samuel with him on visits to schools such as Hilo. Like the manual training schools Weld promoted, Hilo provided both an academic and a practical education, learning and labor in roughly equal parts. Samuel, educated with the same ideals as his father, would later employ them when founding Hampton Institute after the Civil War. Hampton opened in 1868, and a few years later, it famously attracted an earnest young man named Booker T. Washington. In 1875, he gave a commencement address to fellow graduates. Then, like most of them, he went off to teach in rural schools, in a rural school for Black children. Among misperceptions about Hampton and later Tuskegee, which was established in 1881, is that its focus was more on labor than on learning. Actually, it was a teacher training school. Yes, its students worked in the school's fields and learned to make bricks for its buildings, but that was to acquire practical knowledge as well as to help support the school. Hampton and Tuskegee grads were expected to use their education to infuse rural communities with the skills people needed: carpentry, masonry, blacksmithing, and the like. The young men spread the basics of modern agriculture, the young women those of nutrition and sanitation. The Tuskegee idea, thus, was not to produce field hands or domestic servants, but to prepare teachers for the grossly underfunded colleges of the South. Does anyone have any questions? Is this making some sense? Yes? You're still with me? Okay, all right, that's right, thank you. Unlike some of the people in this room, I'm not as good a teacher as, at any rate, so you always want to make sure your class. However, in Rahway, I was very popular. Thank you, thank you. Anyway, okay, the real Tuskegee idea, though, may have had less impact on the school soon to open in Bordentown than another strain of education reform called the manual training movement. The movement's origin are varied, but it's most often regarded as being instigated by an exhibit at the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876. Ever since Weld's time, colleges of technology had been opening nationwide, but their students often arrived with too few practical skills. An exhibit in Philadelphia introduced a step-by-step method in teaching basic school use to remediate this, and schools around the country picked it up. But it is important to note that such practical work was regarded as a complement to an academic education, a cultural asset, not job training. Nevertheless, advocates of manual training contended that the world judges us by what we can do. They also argued that manual work would encourage boys to remain longer in school, enhance their moral and intellectual development, and help encourage better judgment. Others ridiculed the idea, saying, for example, that there was no knowledge in the handle of a plow. As one historian has claimed, manual training was the crux of the most vigorous pedagogical movement of the 1880s. I'm inclined to believe that the young minister credited with establishing the school at Bordentown either saw the influential exhibit in Philadelphia or heard about it, because in 1879, he helped to organize the Colored Technical Industrial Education Association of New Jersey. And it shared a name with dozens of similar initiatives elsewhere, among them the school that grew into Teachers College. 2 years later, in 1881, the state's assembly passed an Industrial Education Act, which helped New Jersey cities establish manual training courses in both elementary and secondary schools. Several communities took the state up on this offer of assistance, and often those that, and started in courses that often complemented local industries. The cultural asset argument about manual training soon gave way to students' and communities' real needs. And I mentioned briefly the Theodore Weld and the Grimke sisters, who I think are not really associated with New Jersey, but they actually had a major impact on New Jersey. Are they familiar names to many people? A few historians. Anyway, Weld was an extraordinary character. So the Reverend Walter Allen Simpson Rice was among those who helped organize New Jersey's Industrial Education Association. Born into slavery in South Carolina, he had served in the Union Army and attended and then taught in a freedmen's school. He then attended Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, where he was an ordained and AME pastor and began to serve churches in New Jersey. He and the others soon determined that Black communities in the state needed a version of the freedmen's schools, but for older students and combined with employable skills. Few records exist of the Bordentown School's founding, but in 1885 or so, Reverend Rice married a church organist in Bordentown, and together they started the school, wanting to provide a wholesome environment and employable skills for these children. I'm now going to sort of skip around a bit because I don't want to keep you here too long. At any rate, Hampton Institute in Virginia was undoubtedly a model. Another was the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia, which was headed by Oberlin graduate Fanny Jackson Copen. It had a strong manual training compartment, and also in 1884, Philadelphia schools introduced them as well. Surviving on local support, the Rice's school grew to enroll several dozen students over the next few years, growth sufficient to attract attention from the state, which acquired it in 1894. They called it the Star of Hope and named it the Manual Training and Industrial School for Colored Youth. The state also acquired a fine piece of property on which to build the campus, and it was the estate of Charles Stewart, which is a mile or so south of Bordentown. And I happen to have a picture of what that looked like, and I will tell, there's some fascinating stories about that, but I'm going to skip through them for right now because I want to get on to some of the other ideas about this. So, but I will note that, Stewart, War of 1812, the Ironsides, and the school in Bordentown was briefly known as the Ironsides Normal School, which also indicates that Hampton had some influence on. So all three schools served roughly grades 6 through 10 at the time. The teacher training aspect of the southern schools would never be that of Bordentown. The needs of the surrounding communities were different, and New Jersey had a pretty good system of teachers that provided teachers for the state. Up to this point, Bordentown schools shared considerable history with schools that provided manual training and industrial skills to white students. It also shared their priorities, character education, harmonious balance between academic and manual work. But in the mid-1890s, soon after its acquisition by the state, the Bordentown School became subject to a set of pressures that differed from those that affected schools for white students. Nationwide, the chief issue was between advocates of the new education, which promoted practical work as a means of fostering the democratic purpose of schooling, or the lessons of John Dewey, and traditionalists who believed that schools should focus on fostering intellectual development. For African Americans, the argument was increasingly more stark as a nadir settled on their communities. The era of Jim Crow had descended on the South. In the North, segregation and inequities became the norm as African Americans fled the South for better opportunities. The sort of schooling that Hampton and Tuskegee offered was of limited value in semi-urban New Jersey, but Bordentown's leadership had to cope with state officials who saw these Southern schools as the model that MTIS should follow. In addition, the school had to walk a fine line between two increasingly antagonistic groups in the African American community: the advocates of an industrial education on one side and advocates for an academic on the other, academic education. For its first 2 decades under state ownership and control, Bordentown survived because it managed to find a balance between the two. And this is a credit to its second principal, a man named James Monroe Gregory. His formal schooling had begun at Oberlin, but he was recruited to join the first class at Howard University in Washington. He then joined its faculty, teaching math and Latin, and he was also a member of the DC School Board. He organized a National Association of Teachers for Colored Children, and he wrote a biography of Frederick Douglass, whose death in 1895 left the nation's African Americans without a leader respected by both blacks and whites. In 1897, state officials called Gregory to be principal of the school in Bordentown, which by then had over 100 students. They were mainly boys, and their ages ranged from 12 to 20. The school day followed the practice at other manual training schools, with academic work in the morning and trade-related courses in the afternoon. Bordentown students were also required to commit 1 afternoon a week to maintaining the campus, which was a practice at Hampton and Tuskegee, as well as the schools that Weld and Rush attended. Gregory and his family, including his wife Fanny and 1 or 2 of their sons, made improving the campus a primary project, and there was a lot of work to do to preparing their fields for livestock and planting. In 1902, the campus got an imposing administration building that stood on a bluff high above the Delaware. Announcing its dedication ceremony, Gregory wrote that it would be the most significant occasion in the history of Negro education in the North. A few years later, MTIS was the subject of a story in the New York Age, one of the nation's leading black newspapers. Called The School of Great Promise, the article was most likely written by T. Thomas Fortune, its publisher. He was at the time living across the state in Red Bank, and he praised the school for putting equal stress on industrial and literary aspects. The article noted that all students were expected to graduate with practical experience in a chosen trade, that literary training was essential for all lines of work, and as were character and good citizenship. Boys dressed in military uniforms and girls in white blouses and dark skirts, as was to be the practice of the school for the next 50 years. The school's graduates recall that MTIS still went only through the 10th grade. Excuse me. The students went on to become carpenters and seamstresses, auto mechanics, printers, and cooks. They were often self-employed or entrepreneurial, given limited opportunities to work in white-dominated businesses. Excuse me. The most interesting aspect of this article for a student of the era is how it placed MTIS in what is understood as a conflict over the kind of education, I'm sorry, the African American most needs. Excuse me. Which was the title of an article that Fortune had written, a very interesting article, by the way, and I'm going to get myself a lozenge so that I hope my voice doesn't crack as much as it's been doing. Did my voice crack a lot when I was at Rahway, or you guys just kept me so amused that that didn't happen, Damien? Anyway, okay, so where did I go? The article noted that all students were expected to graduate with, practical experience in a chosen trade, that literary training was essential to all lines of work, as were character and good citizenship. Oh, I've already said that. Let's go on. Of the article is that it placed the school in the middle of this conflict. Often a bullhorn and a ghostwriter for Booker T. Washington, Fortune and his newspaper were also subsidized by what has been called the Tuskegee machine. But Fortune himself was a brilliant writer with an ability to speak truth to power. Abilities in that regard were increasingly approached those of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was increasingly being recognized as the most forceful critic of Washington's accommodationism. 2 years earlier, Du Bois' essay on Washington's approach had been published, causing a great deal of controversy among educated African Americans, particularly in the North. And the seeming ideological conflict between supporters of Washington's approach and those supporting Du Bois' emphasis on the need for higher education continues to haunt discussions today. As a scholar, James Gregory was predisposed to support Du Bois, but like Washington, he was a head of a school that depended on the support of white people. Fortune's 1905 article demonstrates how well the Bordentown School respected the priorities of both sides. And hanging on one of the easels over there is a copy of that article, which is a little bit hard to read, but it's fascinating. You kind of parse it. It's fascinating about exactly. Fortune was a very clever man, and he knew how to say what he needed to say to keep his supporters and his audience happy. And it's kind of a classic in that regard. So, but a year or so after the article appeared, New Jersey officials felt that MTIS should adhere more closely to what they understood to be the Tuskegee model. Washington was invited to visit the Bordentown campus, and for the next few years, Gregory was under pressure to prepare more students to become workers in the state's increasingly mechanized agriculture industries. But the school's supporters responded that such would require supplying the school with more sophisticated equipment. Also, its graduates showed no interest whatsoever in farming or in becoming farmers. In February of 1915, Gregory announced his resignation. The pressure had apparently been hard on his health. As he told the New York Age, he did not feel equipped to care for the needs of a purely agricultural and mechanical art school. In November, he died, just a few weeks after Washington had. They were both not quite 60. 3 services held in Gregory's honor were not only tributes to his leadership, but gatherings that represented a range of opinions about addressing the educational needs of African American children. One was held in Washington at a church headed by Francis Grimke, who was a nephew of Theodore Weld and a child of the Grimkes, of a Grimke family, of the brother of the Grimke sisters. Okay, do I have that? Pallbearers and speakers included Fortune, Alain Locke, who we credited the Harlem Renaissance is credited in great part to Alain Locke, and Howard's leading intellect of the time, a man named Kelly Miller. Gregory's burial in Bordentown was orchestrated by Monroe Trotter, Washington's most virulent opponent. Then a memorial service in Bordentown, held the following April, included remarks by a wider range of opinion, including the husband of Fanny Jackson Copen of the Institute in Philadelphia and two of the school's most loyal white supporters in the state. So I thought I would pause at this point. If there are, I can continue. If you want me to continue, I will continue. If there are questions people want to ask right now, I should continue? Okay, I'll keep going. Thank you. Soon after Gregory's resignation, a new principal arrived. If Rice was a minister and Gregory a scholar, the school's third principal was an educator, and he came with a list of accomplishments. William Valentine had grown up in Montclair, graduated from Harvard in 1904, and gone to Indianapolis, where he led the transition of a troubled school. Serving an under-resourced Black community, it became a model institution that, in 1915, received a laudatory review in a book called Schools of Tomorrow, written by Dewey's daughter, Evelyn. Of his experience in Indianapolis, Valentine would later recall that he conceived of the school as a social settlement, an indication that his conception may have been influenced by Hull House and similar institutions. He saw the school as a social agent for improving community life, and to that end, it brought in local workers who could not only teach their trade, but interest students in the meaning of the work they did, which was very Deweyan. Valentine brought some of what he had learned in Indianapolis to Bordentown. He would head the school for the next 35 years, decades in which it grew from a valuable experiment pushed in several directions by external pressures into a selective prep school with an elegant campus. It attracted not only a very well-educated faculty, but attention from noted admirers, both Black and white. Enrollment increased rapidly, accommodating children of the Great Migration, which caused the state's Black population to more than triple between 1910 and 1940. In the 1930s were the school's heyday. And to get to that point, Valentine managed to merge the Tuskegee imperative of learning to do useful work with the Du Boisian emphasis on academic ability, leavened with a Deweyan focus on broader participation in a democratic society. The federal Smith-Hughes Act of 1917 likely facilitated the school's rapid growth. These funds helped pay the salaries of vocational education teachers. Between 1915, when Valentine arrived, and 1930, Bordentown's enrollment tripled as well, growing from around 100 students to over 300. That required a major investment in buildings and dorms. If Smith-Hughes funds could be used for teachers' salaries, that freed up money for the state to build the buildings. Students themselves made modest contributions to their room and board, but there was no tuition. The campus did expand, adding athletic fields and tennis courts, as well as faculty housing. The school was a self-contained community that served most of its members' needs. In 1927, MTIS became a full secondary school, providing a solid academic education along with trade training. In 1922, Du Bois visited the campus to give a talk on choosing a vocation, and he would return later a few times, and he tried to get the Nation magazine to do something on the school, but it didn't take up his offer. One of the things that's fascinating, in 1932, an article that Du Bois wrote called Education and Work it was in the first edition of the Journal of Negro Education, and it offered a very balanced assessment of industrial education in colleges. And the article ended by suggesting that each might profit by learning something of the other. One of the things that I find interesting is that this article seldom appears in bibliographies or in works about Du Bois. So there's something interesting in that. In 1928, Valentine, as in William Valentine, received a master's degree from Teachers College. And it could be that while there, he took a course from John Dewey, who was then teaching at Columbia. Though Dewey visited the Bordentown School in May of that year, I have found no record of his reaction. However, given Dewey's highly visible advocacy for an industrial education that expanded rather than limited students' perceptions of their own industrial fate, it is likely that he would have been impressed by what he saw at Bordentown. So, I'm going to skip a little because I want to leave some time for questions. And Damien, thanks for coming, and we will see each other again, I hope. Thank you. In sum, the school had become a singular institution, an educational utopia, as was claimed in a documentary about it that was called A Place Out of Time. And I'm sure the library has a copy of that. I'll show it to you later. Arguably, the school had no peers. Arguably, the school had no peers. During the summer, most students returned home, in part to earn the money they needed to pay their school expenses. While they were gone, the campus performed another singular function. It would host conferences of Black professionals who were not welcome elsewhere, and its tennis courts were, for a while, regarded as a Black Forest Hills. But utopias, by their very natures, do not last forever. Bordentown's enrollment exceeded 400 students in 1940. But it had also attracted criticism from people who questioned its strict discipline and decorum. And in 1947, the words "for colored youth" were dropped from the school's formal name, and some very, very, very modest efforts were made to integrate it. Also, the state had a new constitution, I'm pretty sure Julia is in, that really went hard to eliminate racist practices in the school, and this was an outcome of that effort. In 1950, Valentine resigned, and a new principal took his place. Students at the time later reported that this fourth principal knew that his job was to gracefully disband the school. Then, of course, in 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education, and it became clear that the school's days were numbered. Its last commencement ceremony was held in June 1955, and members of the Gregory and the Valentine's children attended. 59 students got diplomas. Since then, the fourscore and 10 that the school itself existed, the campus served as a research center for children with special challenges, and then also a home for correctional facilities. It joined the it became a National Historic Site. And also in this A Place Out of Time video, one of the things that's fascinating about it is it includes scenes from picnics that graduates would have every summer. They would hold them on the campus. But once the youngest students were in their 80s, those picnics sort of stopped. At any rate, a few years ago, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice began a campaign to reopen the school, suggesting that it could again become an educational institution, preferably one that would replace current correctional facilities for young people. Though one of its buildings has been restored, the amount of asbestos in others could make that prohibitively expensive. The land itself, on a promontory above the Delaware, suggests that it could be a local asset as a public park. The school's legacy, though, is more than its physical attributes. Writing about it, as I have been doing for the past several years, I regard its distinguished history as part tragedy. For one, might their shared admiration for the Bordentown School as an ideal enable John Dewey and W.E.B. Du Bois to work together on defining an industrial education that served and welcomed Black students as well as white. For several decades, Du Bois and Dewey lived and worked within walking distance of each other, but they only met twice. Another misfortune is that Du Bois' misunderstood attitude toward industrial education has impelled future generations of educators to be dismissive toward what they might have learned from Washington's dedication to a balance. Neither man was totally dismissive of the other's approach, despite what ideologues might want us to believe, that they were on opposite sides of a continuum. That simply wasn't so. The two men were products of their contrasting backgrounds, which was ever reflected in their approach to the education of their fellows. Dewey was known for reconciling dualities, so might a Deweyan examination of Bordentown's purpose and accomplishments provide a means for a way forward? So those are my remarks, and I hope to have some audience commentary. And do you want to help me get this? What button do I press to get the? Okay, I just hit this. Okay, and I didn't bring I haven't plugged in my clicker, so I'll just stay here. Okay, this is a picture of a log college, and I don't know exactly where it's from, but it was used for an illustration for an article. Here, I'll just use this. And I have it up, early efforts by Samuel Finley and Benjamin Rush, Johann Pestalozzi, von Wellenberg and Hofwell, Robert Owen and John Griscom. And I'm wondering if those names attract any interest or any commentary about the sort of background of the manual training schools. Oh, okay. What? Oh, did someone say? Oh, yes. Karen, thank you.
Is this, can you hear me? Okay. I'm a historian of medicine, so I think of Benjamin Rush as a physician, and I'm wondering how he got from the log college to getting a medical education. And
well, he went to Princeton or went to college in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. He then studied in Edinburgh, which was the leading the center of medical education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
And then he came back and he was also wrote a lot of.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And this school may have been, there's Neshaminy in Pennsylvania, which we associate with the Tennant family, and the Tennants also had something to do with the founding of Rutgers, I believe. And the Loud College there was kind of the most well-known of all of them, and this could be a picture of that. I don't know. What?
A few things. Samuel Finley, I believe, was more notoriously known for association with the American Colonization Society. And I believe that was the same Finley. He was a Presbyterian minister.
He was a Presbyterian minister, but he died. He died in maybe even before the Revolution. So I don't think.
It wouldn't have been the same.
But he would have had
Finley.
some. Perhaps some of his children might have been involved with the Colonization Society, which I think had its start in the 1820s or
1816. Yeah, okay. A question about John Griscom. Was he from Philadelphia at all?
I don't know. I've read some. I've read some of his writings, and I don't really know his background. I do know that he made this tour of Switzerland and was very impressed with the school.
Okay. I'm just wondering if he was, by any chance, part of the Philadelphia family of Griscoms who were carpenters from the 17th century on through the 18th century and into.
I don't know. A lot of those people.
The most famous member of which was a woman, Elizabeth Griscom Ross, we know as Betsy Ross, and her, work with the flag and all of that. But that was that family, and Elizabeth's great-grandfather was one of the pioneer carpenters in Philadelphia.
Well, it was a big name in early America, so could be. We can talk more about that too. This is Theodore Weld. Wasn't he a handsome guy? And this is the motto of Oberlin College, and like several other institutions at the time, it is labor and learning. And I think that it's very interesting that the manual labor advocates and the early abolitionists were often the same people, and which makes me more fond of the manual labor movement, if I weren't otherwise. This is the picture of Eagleswood in Perth Amboy, which Weld and the Grimke's sisters had a school there. I don't know how much of this was the school, but that's a big body of water back there. This is quite an interesting institution, and I actually wrote an article about it that I have back there, or I mentioned it as part of the history of manual labor in New Jersey, and it's a blog that the Revolution New Jersey group, they're just trying to keep New Jersey or get New Jersey into the celebration of the 250th anniversary. How much time do I have, Cliff?
We're almost to an hour now, so I don't know if you,
All right.
I mean, we don't have anything in here urgently afterwards, but I don't want to keep people too long beyond what we promised, so it's up to you.
Should I move? I'll move quickly through. The thing that I wanted to demonstrate was this is the Hampton motto and that of the University of Illinois. And I just want to point out how similar they were. They were both founded almost at the same time, but the learning and labor aspect of them was substantial. This is an interesting statement that I found in 1889, a resolution of the New Jersey Council of Education, which defines manual training as training in thought expression by other means than gesture and verbal study in a carefully graded course of instruction, as shall also provide adequate training for the judgment and executive faculty. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because manual training was regarded by its advocates as on par with academic training. It was not a matter of how do we train people to work on assembly lines, which is sort of part of its poor reputation, which I hope my book will help undo. Bordentown has all kinds of banners. This is a banner about the Bordentown School. The land was acquired, I said, about Delia Stewart Parnell, one of whose sons was a leader in the Irish Revolutionary movement. And Don Mitchell knows something about that. So I will skip by that quickly and go on to, this is a cover of the Ironsides Echo, which was the name of the school's newspaper. And this is a picture of some members of the Gregory family, which was an extensive group, and they were all sitting on the stairs of this administration building. They were a really leading family and sort of connected to everyone. And the granddaughter of James Monroe Gregory has also been very helpful in the writing of this book. These are two pictures of the campus. This is the administration building from 1908 until 1928, and you can see how it had moved. This is, I have this painting, which I have to thank John Medley for this. He commissioned a woman to do this painting of the school, about 1995 or something like that, John? And it's somewhat idealized, but as you can see, there's the administration building, there's the Delaware and Ironsides. And here are some of the fields. Faculty housing was down here. The girls lived on that side of the campus. The boys lived on this side of the campus. There were a lot of the classrooms for the vocational things were along there. Those are the athletic fields, and when you go down 295, you go down by the fields cut through, or the highway cuts through those fields. So this was quite an elegant place to attend school. So John, thank you for getting this done. Next picture is of the faculty, who were all Black, who all had degrees from notable institutions, and I think this picture was probably taken in the 1950s. The school had scads of activities for its students in the 30s, 40s, whatever, and including glee clubs and a jazz bands that traveled around the state. And, okay, now I want to talk very briefly about the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice has a campaign to, it began about 5 years ago, an effort to close correctional facilities for young people, and the state attorney general has a committee looking into this, and they're coming up with ways to redefine the school and possibly make it of use. And now it's time for me to quit, but I'm going to give one little plug for my book, which just got reviewed by Choice, which is a review mechanism journal for academic libraries. They called it highly recommended. And it, a provocative new study written in a lively style and grounded in much archival research and long overdue. So I find writing a book is easy, selling it is a bit more difficult anyway, but I got to do that too. I want this message to get out there. So I'm going to turn this mic off, and people who want me to sign a book, we go over there. And I don't know how much more time. You have to go somewhere. Cliff, don't you have another event?
I do not. No, I'm here. Yep.
Okay. All right. But do other people have questions they want to ask? Yes.
Just let me bring you the mic. Sorry.
Okay.
Otherwise, it doesn't show up on the recording. So.
Thank you. What about programs that are now offered by New Jersey public schools that include future kind of employment as part of it, whether it's automobile kind of studies, or I don't know what other kinds of programs are available right now. Mercer County has one school. Could you tell us anything about that?
That is something, that's something that I need to do a lot more research about. I know that Monmouth County has 5 highly competitive sort of vocational high schools, and the children that attend them all head on to college. They are not for job training for immediately after high school. There's a vocational school in Monmouth County. I know Brookdale has a very active program of various kinds of certification programs. But high schools, and this is something that I don't know, but I would like to see someone do some research in it. How many high schools are doing that? Greg, you have done a little bit of writing on this topic, haven't you?
Thanks. Just a little bit. I worked with a group of graduate students on a report on some of the work, and Connie's absolutely right that some of the county vocational and technical schools are highly competitive. But many of the just normal districts, if there's a comprehensive high school, will have vocational offerings as well. So it's kind of a little bit of a split. We were looking at how diverse these offerings are, or whether it's sort of tends to track students as another way of going into highly competitive colleges. So it's interesting.
One thing that I learned in my research is that in Switzerland, all students in public secondary schools are expected to have both an academic and a trade-related specialization while they're there. And I think that that is a good idea because there still has been this, they're the techies, they're the other kids. And I think that that has caused vocational education to have a bad name, and it shouldn't. So maybe there are some changes that are underway. So, any other questions or comments? What?
How does Benjamin Franklin factor into your analysis of the development of manual training and industrial education?
Largely positive. There are a couple lines about him in my book, and but I can't tell you exactly what he did. But when you think of the kinds of things that he advocated, like in his Rules for Living and in Poor Richard's Almanac, he would have been positive, would have reacted positively to it.
His support for abolitionism?
What?
His support for abolitionism?
But abolition happened after Franklin. I don't understand your question.
He was one of the big backers, I think one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in
Franklin was?
1787. And he was president of it, I believe, for a time.
Well, thank you, and that's something I don't know. I think that I should now end this talk, and if you want to come look at these pictures, and I will sign books, and I guess I'll do them over here. And I brought along a purple pen. I sign books so they match the cover color, okay? So
We have to thank Connie again, yeah.